Hey, everybody. Good afternoon. Happy Sexual Freedom Month. Welcome to our September Sexual Freedom, Censorship of Sexual Freedom program. My name is Mandy Sally, Chief Operating Officer here at the Woodhull Freedom Foundation, and your host for this panel. I'm going to introduce my fabulous panelists in just a second, but I will just say this is a extra special edition because all of the folks on my panel today are all Woodhull staff, and that is very exciting. I think it's the first time we've done a program like that in this series, so hats off to us for that. I also want to mention, I said it, Happy Sexual Freedom Month. September is Sexual Freedom Month. And this month we have a lot of programming going on. I hope you've seen some of our fabulous social media posts about Sexual Freedom Month. We also have a extra special matching donation this month. So for every donation we receive up to $15,000, those are matched. And so we would really appreciate it if you appreciate the series, if you appreciate the work we do, if you would head on over to woodhullfoundation.org/donate and make a donation, because that donation is worth double this month. So I will also put that link in the chat for folks who want to do that today. Couple housekeeping things. This panel will go on our YouTube page, so it'll be available for you to share with all of your family and friends after you sign off today, or if you can't stay for the whole program, no need to fret, it'll be there for you. Also, any of the resources or links that we mention will come to you in a follow-up email. So you don't need to worry about jotting all of that stuff down. I'm going to send it all to you. It'll be in your inbox probably in about 24 hours. And lastly, please make use of that Zoom chat. We would love to hear your feedback, your comments, your questions during our time together today. So please feel free to pop those in the Zoom chat. We'll do our best to answer them and interact with all of you. Okay, I'm done rambling now. I want to introduce my amazing panelists. First up, we have Larry Walters. Larry heads up the Walters Law Group, which is an AV rated preeminent law firm concentrating in internet law, intellectual property, gaming, and First Amendment issues. But most importantly, he's general counsel here at the Woodhull Freedom Foundation, and we appreciate him so much. Next up, we have Ricky Levy. Ricky is our founder. She's our fearless leader, our president and CEO, and she's been engaged in sexual freedom activism for several decades. Thank you so much for joining me this month, Ricky.
You're welcome, Mandy.
As if we don't talk to each other every day.
Every single day.
And last but certainly not least, we have Allison Grossman. Allison is the senior policy analyst here at Woodhull. She's also a therapist and researcher focusing on sexual freedom, women's sexual empowerment and expression, and equitable policy. If that's not a star-studded panel, I don't know what is. So thank you all. We're going to dive right in. Ricky, I'm going to ask you to kick us off with our first question, and that is, how has the internet changed the landscape of sexual freedom and human rights over the past 2 decades since you've been heading up here our work here at Woodhull?
Oh, that's a great question, Mandy. Let me just run my list, and whatever I leave out, I'm sure someone else will throw in. One way it's changed is with access to information. It's become a major source of sexual health information, especially for topics that would traditionally have been stigmatized or censored. And that's empowered lots of people, particularly youth and marginalized groups, to learn about sexual health, rights, and identity. The internet has also given us a place for community building. Online platforms have allowed LGBTQ plus individuals and other sexual minorities to find community, support, and resources, even in repressive environments. And this has been critical, I think, for advocacy. Another change is around sexual expression. I think the internet has provided new avenues for sexual expression and exploration through things like dating apps, pornography, and sexting. There's kind of an ick there, because while it's expanded sexual freedoms for many, it's also raised concerns about privacy, exploitation, and age-appropriate access. And I know we'll be talking about that later in the program. What else has changed? A way to conduct activism and advocacy using digital tools. So those tools have enabled more coordinated activism around sexual and reproductive rights globally. We can much more easily share information, organize, and put pressure on governments and institutions. Negative. The internet has created new forms of oppression. So while all those good things have happened, the internet has enabled new forms of gender-based violence, harassment, and censorship targeting women, LGBTQ plus people, and sexual rights advocates. I'm thinking of things like revenge porn, online stalking, and the targeted disinformation campaigns. It's also provided the government with a way to surveil and control and restrict sexual freedoms, to censor content, and to prosecute people based on their online sexual expression or identities. Going back to a plus, we've had access to services, telemedicine, online pharmacies, massive expansion of access to sexual and reproductive health services. But the digital divides mean the access isn't really equal. I think that the internet has changed norms. I think that exposure to diverse sexual content and communities online has helped to shift social norms and attitudes around sexuality in many places. Unfortunately, that's not always a shift in the right direction for the work Woodhull does.
Yeah, which I'm sure we're going to touch on a little bit more as we get into our conversation.
We are, because there are also, because of the growth of the internet, new ethical and legal challenges. The internet has raised complex new questions around sexual consent, privacy, free speech, and regulation that our legal systems are still grappling with.
That's a I don't want to cut you off, Ricky, but that's
I know. I was just going to ask if I missed anything.
That was a really excellent segue into my next question, which is for Larry. And that is, what are some of the key legal challenges in protecting sexual freedom, privacy, and freedom? I said that twice online.
Yeah, well, first, very happy to be here. Thanks for Woodhull for putting this together. Appreciate everybody who's attending. As Ricky eloquently laid out, the internet has changed a lot in the last 20, 30 years. It's allowed people with diverse sexual interests and orientations to connect with like-minded individuals across the globe. It used to be that we were locked into our own social groups made up of our families or coworkers and neighbors who are geographically close. Now people can connect with others who share their interests and quirks and kinks and views, and no matter where they are in real time. But the government's first instinct when it came to the internet was to censor it. In 1996, the government passed the Communications Decency Act, which prohibited all indecent content on the internet. That's a lot of content when you come to think of it. Arguably, most of it. But the government tried to prohibit and criminalize anything indecent on the internet. That law also had a separate section dealing with immunity to online platforms for content uploaded by users. And that was inserted to protect the marketplace of ideas and the robust growth of the internet. Fortunately, the ACLU and others stepped up to challenge that law, the Communications Decency Act, the indecency prohibitions and won. A unanimous Supreme Court in 1997 said that the law was unconstitutional. But that immunity provision was not challenged and remained. That's now called Section 230, as we refer to it. And the combination of the court invalidating that prohibition on indecent communications and allowing the remainder of the statute providing that immunity created a very robust and free internet for many years. And it was, the kind of the golden age. People could communicate and find each other and explore their sexuality and express themselves. But over time, the government's instinct again to censor and oversee and regulate started to arise again. And as we saw in 2018, the government started chipping away at that immunity I mentioned by passing Fossa Sesta, which imposed restrictions and criminalized certain content on the internet involving prostitution, which dramatically affected sex workers and forced online platforms to censor certain content. A lot of websites shut down or eliminated their sections involving dating and interaction under the fear of prosecution under this law. And that's still happening today. And there are more calls for regulation and further chipping away on that immunity. We're starting to see the courts, despite 20 years of very good decisions protecting online platforms and the free exchange of ideas, including sexually oriented speech, now chipping away at those immunities in decisions, holding platforms liable under new theories like the platform is addicting, or it is a dangerous device, or other kind of novel theories to try to force the platforms to further censor speech with which the government disagrees or some private party disagrees. We're seeing age verification statutes being passed at the state level at an alarming pace. There are a number of laws that have been passed. Other bills are pending, and cases going up to the U.S. Supreme Court, which Woodhull is involved with. I think you'll start seeing some stuff about that on Monday on Woodhull's efforts to make sure that case goes the right way. But the governments at the state level have taken it upon themselves to essentially become the parent and to decide for their children what content should be available and burden the access to that content for adults by forcing adults to use age verification or produce IDs or other information to access adult content sexually protected expression. So that's a challenge. There are answers to a lot of those questions and ways to strike balances, but those are certainly the challenges, and we're watching the cases very closely. We're involved with some of them, and we are hopeful that the courts will continue to protect the free and robust internet and keep it available for sexual expression.
I hope so, Larry. I hope things continue to go in a positive direction with the courts. Allison, I want to ask you a question. How do issues of sexual freedom online intersect with our other human rights concerns like freedom of speech or association?
Yeah, so I think those human rights like freedom of speech, association, expression, the whole list. These are all things that are predominantly happening online now. And like other human rights violations, as we've seen time and time again, the first people affected or censored are those existing outside of kind of the heteronormative ideals, right? And so, of course, sexual freedom, sexuality is ripe to be censored and always has been. And now that it's online, like Ricky alluded to very eloquently, like it gives us more access to sexual freedom, but then it also gives more access to those who want to censor it, who want to respond to it. And as Larry mentioned, the censorship kind of coming from these not always, they're kind of novel ideas. Like we don't really know if that's useful. We don't really know what we're doing right, but this legislation is kind of being thrown at it. There's kind of limitless examples of this, but I'll give a couple. So for example, the blocking of certain social media accounts or restricting sexuality language. We see how the right to freedom of speech and expression is really hindered there for sex workers, for example, among many other people. And of course, that trickles down into loss of income, loss of safety for them. right? We also see how certain algorithms might be moderating and removing content related to sexuality. And this isn't just, explicit sexual content, which, we are also free to access, but it's also education around reproductive health, or community building, like Ricky also mentioned, for LGBTQ youth, which we know is so important for safety and well-being, right? And so that freedom of association is really being removed. A third example is, all of this age verification that's now restricting access to sexual content. Not only, never mind the security issues around that, but also those rights there are being restricted without equity, right? So, for example, people who are unhoused or immigrants without ID, access to, valid ID, they are losing that access to expression if they can't, circumvent the age verification. Those are just a couple examples. I mean, they kind of go on and on. But yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
Really excellent examples, and illustrates the number of different ways that we're seeing our human rights violated through legislation that's, oftentimes meant to protect. Ricky or Larry, anything to add before I ask you our next question?
I would just add that the challenges that we see towards sexual expression are typically motivated by two kind of calls. One is protect the children, and the other is to protect victims of sex trafficking or sexual exploitation. And in the name of these, two laudable goals, state and federal lawmakers have passed, very sweeping censorship laws that kind of overreact to the concern and impact the rights of adults to either participate in sexual expression or get access to and consume sexual expression online. These laws are often aimed at the gatekeepers, like online platforms, and then to protect themselves from liability, they're forced to do the dirty work of the government and burden access to sexual expression. Otherwise, they get sued or they have potential liability. We're also seeing payment processors kind of get in on the action and impose additional burdens and compliance obligations, records keeping, age verification, content moderation obligations on the merchants or the platforms, websites that offer sexual expression, and thereby limiting access to protected speech or burdening it again. But those are the two kind of arguments that are always thrown out as a justification to censor the internet or censor sexual expression. And we're seeing, both of those being very effectively used by the anti-pornography and pro-censorship community currently.
Absolutely. Ricky, anything you want to add?
No, I don't think so. I think that got covered really, really well. I just want to restate what Larry stated. Those are the two flags: protect the children and sex trafficking. And the harms done under those two rubrics, it's even hard to catalog how much harm has been done. But we try to catalog it.
We sure do. Well, it seems to me like there should be a way to strike a balance between safety and promoting safety online, because as you've all alluded to, there is stuff on the internet that could be harmful or cause harm. But how do we balance the concern about safety with our rights, our ability to express ourselves online and our rights to sexual expression? I'll start it off with Allison.
Yeah, I mean, I think, for me, a couple of things come to mind, right? So one is this idea that a lot of what's being kind of censored is already illegal. Like, it is already illegal to share images that are sexually explicit of children. That we don't necessarily need more laws. Maybe we need to evaluate the effectiveness of the laws, how to implement them better, for sure. And so I think there's like this misguided idea that more legislation is the key versus maybe editing or working with the legislation we have. I think, the second, there's, I think, probably several more, but the second thing that I'm thinking about is this kind of like platform versus personal protection. So unilateral policy that that Larry mentioned kind of entices platforms to restrict all sexuality versus really uplifting. We have some device-based blockers, parental controls. These things do work, and if we elevated access to them, we could actually keep kids safe more effectively without restricting rights. Similar when I think about, media literacy, porn literacy, all the stuff that we should be talking about in a sex ed space, either educating parents to talk about it, incorporating in our sex ed curriculum, that's really missing. And so we're kind of losing access to approaches that would be far more effective for this, what feels like this kind of over politicized effort of like, see, we're protecting the kids, and we're not really, we're just kind of saying we are, right? And so that's kind of how I think about it.
Go ahead, Ricky.
Oh, could you tell I wanted to say something?
It's that telepathic connection we
Yes,
have.
it is. So using the government to protect children just gives me a little bit of a stomachache. I think that the decisions about what a child should and shouldn't see should come from their parents. And Allison, those parental controls that you mentioned would give the parent that ability. We talked a little bit earlier about how protect the children and prevent sex trafficking are the two red flags thrown up to pass all kinds of harmful legislation. I honestly, I don't know that I don't have an answer to strike a balance between safety and restricting speech online. But I would say, as you said, Allison, the speech that's illegal is already illegal. I don't know that we need any more laws. I don't think speech should be restricted. Certainly, I endorse protecting children from anything that would be harmful to them. But then we get into the discussion about what is actually harmful to a child. And I will stop there before our general counsel has a heart attack.
Before he stops you.
Yes.
One of the things that I would like to bring to this conversation that I think could potentially be an interesting solution that we're not always thinking about that is legislative would be comprehensive data privacy protections. We don't have that currently in the US. Europe has their own version. It's not something I think that gets brought up when we're talking about these kids' online safety laws, but it's something I would love to hear our legislators talk about more. I also think the approaches you mentioned, Allison, are sort of the idea that, and I've said this in other programs before, but an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? Doing something proactively to give youth, but not only youth, adults, tools to be able to have literacy about what is online is really helpful. Increasingly important as we see more and more AI generated content online. I think that's important for all of us, regardless of your age. So this legislation is often reactive. I'd love to see more proactive approaches. But before I move on to my next question, Larry, was there anything you wanted to add?
Well, I would add and echo Allison's comment about not needing more laws. We've got plenty of laws on the books and regulations. There's a good book out there. I think it's called A Felony a Day, about how most people commit at least one federal felony every day going about their normal lives, given the tens of thousands of laws and regulations that are already on the books. But we do need to think more comprehensively about solutions that would protect both privacy and expression. You mentioned the data privacy issues. There are a lot of pros and cons to those approaches, and we do see now a number of states. I think we're up to maybe 15, 20 that have passed their own version of data privacy acts because the federal government hasn't been able to come up with a federal policy. That approach is, in my view, absolutely the wrong one, because it creates this patchwork of different privacy obligations, disclosure obligations, records keeping, notification obligations that are different in every state and almost impossible to comply with by the platforms and website operators that are out there, trying to provide access to content or services to consumers. It would be preferable to have a federal policy, certainly, than a state-by-state policy. But going back just finally to the censorship efforts and the government taking on the job of the parents, that is a real concern, and that's what's motivating not only these age verification laws for adult content, but even the restrictions on accessing social media platforms. Now we see a number of states, requiring that children cannot access social media platforms unless they're a certain age or unless they have parental permission or provide some kind of documentation or consent. And it's becoming more and more of, like I say, a nanny state, the government attempting to do the job of the parents, while the parents have access to increasingly effective technology to be able to block their children's access to inappropriate content that the parent deems to be inappropriate. There's a wide variety of settings that can be used, that can be controlled based on the age of the minor. Some content is perfectly acceptable for a 17-year-old, but not acceptable for a 9-year-old. And the parents have the tools to be able to do that for their children. But unfortunately, the government is taking the position that we know better, or we don't trust the parents to do it. That, I believe, is the wrong approach. And the age verification efforts that have been implemented have been shown to actually harm children by blocking their access to the sites that will comply with the age verification laws. The responsible large platforms that are going to comply with the laws, and forcing them to find the content on dangerous sites, dangerous parts of the internet, because they can't access it on the large platforms that they're familiar with. They're going to find it, most likely, in some way. But now they're being forced into areas of the internet that can result in exploitation or other forms of harm to children. So, I believe that this is the absolute wrong approach that the government is taking currently. And I laud those that are in the fight to try to put a stop to it.
You've all illustrated so effectively how keeping kids safe online is troubling language when we're talking about legislation, at least right now in the year 2024. And Allison, I wonder if you could speak a little bit to some of the common myths we're hearing, in addition to the keeping kids safe online. What else are we hearing that's not quite true to justify this legislation?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously misinformation is rife in policy work, but nowhere more, in my opinion, than sexuality. There's just so much bias and bad research going on. So there's a ton of myths supporting these policies. So some of them, the falsehoods really, it's kind of just, there's like this general status of overblown statistics, and that comes from this like moral panic, right? So examples of those myths might be like, kids are accessing porn at alarming rates, right? We hear these numbers and when you go to look at it, there's just no research, right? So things like that around like the numbers of kids accessing porn or sexual content, the numbers of kids being trafficked through these avenues, those are a lot of myths that we just don't really have numbers for. And then there's also this kind of the technology-based side of these myths. It's kind of what Larry was speaking to before, that one, that these things work, right? Like that's its own myth, that if we just put these restrictions on, kids will be safer. That age verification is totally safe and secure, right? That's something we hear all the time. And inversely, like that device-based filters or parental controls aren't, that they don't work, which is a falsehood often touted. There's a lot more, but that's kind of the headline. Something else I'll just say, though, when we think about what supports this legislation, is that there's a lot of subjective language being put in, and I think it's supported because these myths are being yelled almost at an alarmist rate. So we're allowing, when I say we, the government is allowing really subjective language like harmful content or sexually inappropriate. And as I think Larry said before, Ricky, what is sexually inappropriate for a 9-year-old is different than that for a 15-year-old. But we're missing some of this nuance because we're reacting to these moral panicky, so to speak, myths at a really high rate, which wasn't really your question, but I just wanted to name it as well.
You answered my question. And I will also say that we have actually done the work here at Woodhull. And when I say we, I mean Allison, not me. I just get to talk about it, which is great. We've done the work of fact checking these myths with our program called Fact Check by Woodhull. I will drop a link to that in the chat. These are freely available on our website. We have identified these common myths and then gone to the research and said, is this true? Is this not true? And our hope is that all of you, one, will go to the website and read them because it's excellent information for all of us to have as citizens. But two, print those out. They are PDFable and downloadable very easily on the website. It's a big raspberry colored button that says download here. And take those to your legislators, particularly when you're empowered after you get off this webinar to fight this legislation. You're going to print those fact checks out and you can email it, send it, whatever you need to do to your legislator and say, hey, that thing you said is true, that you baked into this legislation isn't actually true. So everyone should check those myths and fact checks out at the end of our program. But Larry and Ricky, I'd love to go to you and tell us, are there other myths that you hear to justify this legislation beyond what we've talked about so far? Ricky, take it away.
So mine aren't about numbers. No surprise to those who know me. But I would say a myth that discussing sex or providing comprehensive sex education encourages promiscuity or risky sexual behavior. Evidence shows that comprehensive sex ed leads to safer sexual practice. So that's a myth. A myth that bodily autonomy and sexual rights undermine traditions, religions, or group decision-making. In fact, bodily autonomy requires collective action to dismantle restrictive norms. The idea that sexual pleasure is frivolous compared to other aspects of sexual health, when in fact it can be empowering. I have more, but I know we have a limit on time. And I want to hear what Larry has to say.
Well, a lot of my work involves representing adult companies, either website operators or producers, and we see myths associated with the with adult content industry repeatedly, including that adult performers cannot consent to production of adult content, that they are always in some way coerced and don't have free agency or free will in being able to perform or engage in sexual expression. Individuals are drawn to adult content production for a wide variety of reasons, including lifestyle, work hours, money, excitement, artistic fulfillment. And it's simply wrong to say that performers are always forced or often forced. It is true to say that most of us are forced to do their job in some way out of economic necessity, and we have to pay the bills, right? That's not the same thing as exploitation, and let alone trafficking. But those concepts routinely get conflated, and those in the adult entertainment industry, adult content production industry, are labeled as always exploited, not having any agency. Simply not true. The incidence of actual sex trafficking in the adult entertainment content production industry is extremely low. It's a very highly regulated industry, requiring compliance with federal laws and regulations and payment processor requirements, et cetera. So it's very minimal incidence of sex trafficking or child exploitation in the adult content production industry. So that's clearly a myth. The other that we see is that pornography fuels or increases sex trafficking. Again, not true. The argument is that somehow consumption of adult content fuels the trafficking of performers in the industry or makes consumers less sensitive to the needs of sex trafficking victims. That's been widely debunked by Woodhull and by others. That's a good fact check on that. Again, the industry is highly regulated. Consumption has never been shown to create a higher incidence of sex trafficking in the adult entertainment industry. And the adult content producers are highly sensitive to compliance with both sex trafficking laws and child exploitation laws out of business interest, for one. It's certainly not in their best interest to produce content non-consensually or underage content, high liability and exposure if they do so. And they believe it's simply wrong, like the rest of society at large. So those are two myths that we commonly see that are not true and have been debunked.
There's a lot of misunderstanding for folks outside of these industries and these spaces about what actually goes on, right? And there's this misperception that there's kind of seedy stuff happening when that really is not the case. Allison, I'd love to take it back to you because I want to talk a little bit more about the process of fact check and what is available for folks, kind of the TLDR. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to some of the truths you discovered while working on fact check.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, the goal of fact check and what I'm doing is basically reading as much of the research as I can, and kind of distinguishing and critiquing that which is really sound research and that which maybe is less generalizable, right? Like, okay, so that's what one study found, but is it being misinterpreted? How is it being used? The biggest takeaway for me, and what a lot of these fact checks get into, is that many of these myths are upheld by one or two statements, statistics, anecdotes, and then that's taken as truth. So a lot of what I do is look at the research and say, like, okay, that's anecdotal. That was one person's experience, and it's totally valid. Not to speak for others, but I don't think anyone on this panel is sitting here saying, like, all sexuality online is amazing, the internet's perfect, right? Of course not. So there are bad experiences, and we can appreciate that. And an anecdote doesn't mean we need to censor the First Amendment, right? Like, of course, that's a huge jump. Another thing that I kind of summarize a lot is research and studies that take correlation and conflate it with causation, which is kind of, the biggest misuse of research, and it happens across every discipline, and again, tons in sexuality, but assuming that because two things are correlated, it means one's causing the other. And that comes up so often in this idea that, like, the internet must be causing XYZ effect. And generally, when we look deeper into it, that's just not there. We just don't have the research onto it in it. Another big thing I'll talk about is that a lot of these studies don't use consistent language. So similar to what I was saying before, this comes up a lot in research of, like, exploitation, trafficked, and then people just kind of being, unfulfilled at work, right? Those are not all the same thing, but research will, people might take that language from research because research isn't clarifying, and it makes it really hard to generalize, to do anything with that research. And the last thing I notice a lot in this fact check is just the general absence of kind of sex positive research. So some of the absence of research is like, we don't, and I'm not arguing that we should be researching more about kids in porn, right? Like, I don't really think that's something that we want to be doing more of, but that also means we just don't have the numbers, which is fine, but something that we should know, right? So, like, if we're hearing numbers about that, where did that come from? We're also not looking at positive effects of sex. So much of the research we have is just really harm-based. And so we're just missing this whole other space. And so an example of that is this idea of the community that one can access online, especially people in the queer community, sex workers who get tips on, safety and bad client lists online, right? So if we remove all of that, we are actually losing access to safety, but there's not as much research on that because we're not taking this very sex positive lens or community focused lens. So there's so many examples. I mean, I'm happy to give more about specific myths that I found. Maybe I'll just give a couple that we talked about. So a big one, of course, is that, age verification is safe, it's secure, and research continuously shows here kind of globally that it can't be 100% secure because hackers will hack and data breaches occur. And there's tons of examples of people being extorted or blackmailed because of what's found, in their because of the age verification data that's been hacked through. So that's just an example, but of a myth that's really upheld. And then when you look deeper at the research, it's, there's no research to support it, and often the opposite is supported. So I don't know, that's just kind of a bit of a summary about what happens at fact check, but it's more succinct in the actual right. So read what I've written, it'll make more sense.
Yes. Allison has spent countless hours reading all of the research for you, the research that exists. That's an excellent point you made about some of it we just don't have the research for. I think that's a really good point, and that we need to be learning about. So any aspiring researchers in the crowd, we'd love some sex positive research, just saying. So thank you for that. I think that was really thorough, and I appreciate you explaining all of that. Larry or Ricky, anything you wanted to add? No. Okay.
I think Allison covered it.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay. So I have a question. I'm going to sort of flip our direction here a little bit and talk about what we would like to see. We spent a lot of time talking about what we don't like, but I wonder if there are policy changes or legal reforms that we should prioritize to better protect our sexual freedom online in the digital age, as is our title of this program. Ricky, why don't you kick us off?
Actually, I was going to ask you a question.
You're really going to flip it. You're going to ask the moderator a question.
I'm going to flip it. Are you talking about changes to current policy or legislation that we'd like to introduce?
Say that for me one more time.
So, for example, policy changes. I would like to see the age verification laws gone. There's a policy change. I'd love to see cess to foster repealed. There's a policy change. But is that what you were actually looking for? Or are you looking for, if I had control of the Congress, what would I do? Oh my God, I love that.
Well, that's a scary thought.
I'd call Larry.
Good clarifying question, Ricky. I am looking for things we would like to see. So not necessarily repeal this, take away that, because I think we've done a pretty good job explaining what we're not liking. I'm kind of looking for, what would you like to see? What would you like to see a senator introduce, or perhaps a brand new presidential administration prioritize, come January? That's what I was looking for.
So I have a quick wish list that is by no means complete. I want to hear what Larry and Allison are thinking, but I'd sure love to see consensual adult sex work decriminalized. I would like to see, well, let me start with that and pong to Larry.
Well, you have identified, the three key policy changes that I would certainly like to see, which is decriminalization of consensual sex work, repeal of FOSTA SESTA, and repeal or invalidation of all the state age verification laws. I would also, if I had a magic wand, like to see Congress reaffirm what they intended in Section 230 to set the courts straight kind of once and for all, that we really did intend to have a vibrant internet and robust marketplace of ideas, and to short circuit some of this chipping away on Section 230 immunity that we're seeing in the courts in recent years. So whether that's, an amendment to the law to make it clearer or broader, or a reaffirmation that, hey, when we said it the first time, we meant it. And so, don't start chipping away at it. I'd like to see something like that. We talked a little bit about privacy rights, and maybe we'll get into that deeper, but there is likely some room for protecting individual privacy and our own data as we carry it around and create this digital footprint everywhere we go and with everything we do. There's a tremendous amount of government surveillance that occurs that I would like to see stop. Changes to the FISA courts and warrantless searches, and the end to sale of our data to the government as a workaround to the Fourth Amendment protections that we would otherwise have against unlawful search and seizure. So that's a few on my hit list.
Short list, easily accomplished.
Yeah.
Allison, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I second all of those. Yeah, super accessible changes. I hope they happen immediately, but they would all be really helpful. The things that I think about are going back to that idea of providing some personal agency, bringing that privacy and protection to the parents. So I think about policy that makes those device-based blockers and parental control super accessible, super affordable, really clear language around what they do for someone who doesn't have the privilege of time and money to like navigate that and make a choice, and filter through all the options. And I would also love to just see more mainstream, clear education around porn and media literacy, tech literacy for parents, porn and media literacy, honestly, for kids and parents. I just think there's so much more that people want agency over. And if we made that really accessible through policy, perhaps they'd be able to have that agency.
I appreciate all of the things that you suggested. And Ricky, I know you have a few more suggestions. I just want to make a quick point in saying that some of these suggestions, things we'd like, it's not the connection between sexual freedom and human rights maybe isn't readily apparent, but I appreciate the ways in which you're all illustrating how these things are central to our sexual freedoms, and sort of forcing our viewers to think a little bit outside of the box about the limits of sexual freedom and human rights. So just wanted to make that point, and now I'll go back to Ricky. I want to hear a few more of those items on your list.
Thanks. And Allison and Larry, thank you. You did all the heavy lifting for me. I can just slide here. I would like to see legislation that grants personal autonomy to women in regard to their reproductive rights. I realize that's a states' rights issue right now. I'd like to unrepeal Roe v. Wade, which probably has never happened in the history of the court. I would like the rest of my wish list isn't about online. It's offline too. I'd like to end the censorship of library books. I'd like to see better education in our schools, more comprehensive. Maybe that's a federal mandate on what's in a curriculum. I don't know. I think about these things all the time. In fact, I usually start every day with Mandy saying, I have an idea for something we should work on.
It's true.
Yeah.
It is true. It's important you bring that up, what is happening offline, though, and I'm not going to take us too far down this road, except to say that legislation and the behavior of social media platforms is what our discussion is focused on today, but it doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? We still all live lives outside of our computer screens, and so what is happening IRL does have an impact on what happens on the internet. They support one another. There's a relationship there. And speaking of technology, I want to just take a second for all of you to look into the future with me, not talking about legislation now, but I want to talk a little bit about technology, specifically trends in technology. And I wonder if we could talk a little bit about which technologies you see having the biggest impact on sexual freedom, say in the next several years. Larry, I'll ask you to kick us off for that one.
Well, no discussion on that point would be complete without acknowledging the incredible importance of AI on sexual expression and how it could likely change the the entire discussion and regulations and laws and experiences, the ability to create depictions of individuals saying and doing things they would never say or never do can be very problematic. And at the same time, people will now have the freedom to create expression depicting themselves or others engaging in acts that they can't do and wish they could do, or say things that they are unable to say in a way that the AI would allow them to say it. So there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of risk created by AI, and it's something that the law is being far outpaced by the technology, as it always is, but it's developing so quickly that it's going to impact all aspects of our life, all careers, all interactions, and online and in the real world. But when it comes to sexual expression, it's certainly something that we have to pay attention to. There are some laws that are being evaluated and some passed, trying to prevent deep fakes, AI deep fakes of recognizable individuals engaging in sexual activity without their permission. I think that those are certainly tolerable and consistent with the First Amendment. The government has also gone too far in certain instances, prohibiting, for example, like California did recently, memes or AI productions that include misinformation or disinformation. That's a concept that has no recognizable meaning in the law. Misinformation is just what the other side doesn't like, but all of it is protected speech. And so the government can overreact when it comes to these new technologies as well. So the key is striking a balance, but I think that's probably one of the main concerns we'll be facing within the next year or so.
Yeah. Allison, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, of course, AI comes to mind first for me as well. I think a trend, and this is maybe like an adjacent answer to your question, but a trend that I think is happening now in response to technology is what's been mentioned throughout, this discussion is this allowing, this leading with kids' safety, which of course is so true, and we should always lead with that. But I think as, the Kids Online Safety Act goes through and starts to pass, where I think we'll start to see a lot more policy kind of being blatantly allowed under this now agreed upon pretense that online equals bad for kids. And I think the risk of that is, we're losing a lot of the nuance of what specifically is bad, what isn't, what would actually be helpful, what isn't helpful. So that's kind of a trend I've been noticing. And in some ways it's not new, right? I mean, I think that's the idea of a moral panic has always existed in that way. But I think it's supporting policy now more than ever related to technology.
Yeah, that's a good point. Ricky, what about you?
I am not a technology person, but if I could wish something, I would wish, I guess it's based on AI, the bots that censor posts online are probably based on some form of AI or algorithm. And they don't just sweep inappropriate posts, they sweep any post. There is no discernment in what they sweep. If we are going to remove certain things to protect certain people, and I'm not going down that road, but if we are going to do that, then let's do it well in a way that doesn't censor important information. We've been censored on Instagram repeatedly because we're always talking about sexual freedom. Scarletine, which is a youth education, sex education platform that's been around forever, is always censored for whatever they put out. We're censoring vital information, and you can, I guess, find someone who will review your post, but that's also not often a human at the first level. I mean, you have to keep banging on the door. So I guess that would be, if I could see technology improving, that would be what I would want to see improve.
Yeah. The practices. more humanity maybe in technology would be how I would sum that up.
More humanity in the world would be good too.
It would be good. It would
Yeah.
be nice.
Yes.
So this was a very fruitful discussion. I learned a lot. I always learn a lot during these programs. There are a number of questions we didn't get to, which is okay, because we had a great discussion, and I'm really thankful that all of you gave us some of your time today. I hope for folks listening in that you learned something, that you're feeling inspired to go out in the world and fight censorship and fight harmful legislation and stick up for your sexual freedom and human rights. The last thing I will say as I wrap us up today is it is still Sexual Freedom Month, and we could really use your support this month. So if you head on over to woodhullfoundation.org/donate, make a donation to support the great work we do at Woodhull, which includes hosting programs like this, which are free and will always include interpretation and will always live on YouTube as a resource for all of you. As a reminder, all donations we receive this month are matched up to $15,000. So donating, your donation is doubled. So thanks everybody for being here. Look out for an email from me with all of the great links and resources mentioned by our panelists today, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I know.